Hello everyone. This is Raza Kazmi. I'm a conservation communicator with WCT, and for this Wildlife Week, we've decided to bring to you a lot of interesting conversations with eminent ecologists and wildlife biologists. And today in the series, I'm delighted to have Dr. Uma Ramakrishnan. Just a quick intro to Dr. Ramakrishnan. Dr. Uma Ramakrishnan is a molecular ecologist, conservation geneticist, and professor at NCBS since 2005. Uma has worked on standardizing methods to work with non-invasive samples in wildlife and conservation, and pioneered the use of genomic data for endangered species. Her work has contributed to our understanding of connectivity and its landscape correlates, and in identifying isolated populations. She is a fellow of the Indian National Science Academy, Indian Academy of Sciences, and the American Association for Arts and Science. She won a molecular ecology prize in 2023, the Sastra Biosciences Award in 2024, and has been a Fulbright Fellow, a DAE, Outstanding Investigator, and a Ramanujan Fellow. Uma is also passionate about mentoring, outreach, and communication. I could go on and on about Uma, but it's a brief intro. So, welcome, Uma, and
Thank you.
I think rather than you know going on with all your achievements, I should now start with the questions. And there are so many that I have, but I think the first would be that your work in wildlife genetics in India ranges across multiple species, and it has been path-breaking in ways more than one. Especially when it comes to tigers, your name is pretty much synonymous with the field of tiger genetics in India. Prerna Bindra has rightly christened you as India's wildlife detective. In her essay on you in the book Women in the Wild, a book plug-in, you should definitely read that essay to know more about Uma's wonderful work. So for your audience, and our audience, could you talk a bit more about your work over the years and what secrets does such genetic work unveil?
So thanks, Raza, for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this forum. WCT is a very old uh, collaborator organization worked with for a long time. So I guess I've been really lucky to work in India on wildlife for the last almost 20 years now. Um, and I think that it's been like like many research journeys, a journey of discovery. And as you open one door, you go in, and there are more doors, and then you find more and more interesting things. My initial interest in working on tigers was actually piqued by a paper in 2004, just before I started my job, by Shujin Luo and others on the phylogeography of tigers, range-wide phylogeography across the world. And that paper uh, somehow I was perplexed by, because it did not show very high genetic variation for tigers in India. In fact, it showed that the Indian subcontinent was not very remarkable in terms of genetic diversity. So I was immediately curious, because even then, a large proportion of the world's tigers were in India. Today, that proportion is probably 70% of global tigers are here. And so, just a very simple minded interest, what's happening in tigers in India in terms of genetic variation. And of course, I realized immediately that the samples that they had were only from the Western Ghats and from the Tarai, Nepal Tarai, simply because they were working with blood. So, the first simple minded questions were, what is genetic diversity of tigers across India? How is it partitioned across the landscapes? And uh, in order to answer that question better, can we work with more accessible samples like non-invasive samples? So these kind of questions, motivated the journey. And if you think about it, a lot of our discoveries along the way, how variable are Indian tigers compared to those globally? What are the populations of tigers, quote unquote, genetic populations or landscapes of tigers? How has genetic variation changed over time? Are there populations that are already isolated? what is connectivity in these landscapes? These are all sub questions if you think about it, and it's not very remarkable. It's just like following your nose, and the next question comes up. So basically, we've just been following this path of inquiry, and many questions still remain unanswered. I think um, I'm not sure I'll get to answer them all, but I also have always been had a strong interest in conservation from when I was young, and so I've always tried to think of what does this mean, because as such, the field of population genetics, which is generally broadly what I work in, these processes are known that when you have fragmentation, you will have loss of genetic variation, you will have loss of connectivity in small populations, you will have what's called genetic drift. These kinds of things are known, and the theoretical underpinnings are kind of well worked out. What we don't know is how they play out, the particulars in specific species. And that becomes important in the context of species which are endangered, because that knowledge can then help us think about strategies for what is today called restoration genomics or genetics. So, vulnerability is what we've been investigating, and now, or hopefully, that understanding of vulnerability, what is the vulnerability for a specific population, specific landscape, helps think about how to ensure a future. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I think that was quite fascinating. So, because you've touched upon or spoken about tiger genetics, I think that's a good segue to the next question that I had in mind. And that is, could you just tell us about your work in tiger genetics over the years? How is it carried out? Which landscapes have you looked into? And what have been some of the most exciting finds over the years about India's tiger populations through your research?
Yeah. So basically, I guess, initially we were basically answering this question: how genetically variable are Indian tigers? And we did this with fecal samples from across the country. And if you look back at those original papers, there was like so few samples as compared to what we are able to work with today. The original work, I think, published in 2009 with 36 samples. But that also indicated, even with those very small data sets, that Indian tigers have more genetic variation than those, across the world, like everywhere across the world. And B, that there are, at least some landscapes of tigers. So basically, central India sort of as a cluster, the Tarai and Northeast. Northeast is something it's always been a little bit difficult to resolve that nexus, Tarai, Northeast, Central India, and the connections. But anyway, broadly, there is population structure. There are varied populations or landscapes. And also, we at that time standardized approaches to identify individuals and estimate population size. In fact, that was when I first met Anish in 2000. I think it was 2006, where he was actually doing his master's thesis in Bandipur, and the samples that he collected, we worked together on for a population estimate of based on a capture recapture framework and individual identification genetically of tigers. And what we did at that time, which was different, was given there was camera trapping happening at the same time, we compared our genetic estimate to the camera trap estimate. So that's a good thing because you can actually cross validate those two approaches, and they were very comparable, which was very reassuring. And then basically, thinking about the central Indian population or cluster, we were curious about connectivity. There was a lot of development happening at the time, a lot of highways coming up, and motivated by a master's MSc wildlife student, Aditya Joshi, we jumped into this area of trying to understand connectivity using a genetic lens. So basically, it's quite simple. If you have two populations which are isolated, then their genetics or their genetic signatures are quite distinct. However, if they are connected, You can imagine two, I don't know, like two cans of paint, they mix. And so you have more sharing, right, between those populations. So an index of sharing or not sharing tells you about connectivity and realized connectivity. And basically, then you map that back to what are the landscape elements which are between these two, say, protected areas. If it's all forest in one case, or green cover in one case, and in the other case where there's no connectivity with something else, you correlate and you infer that these land use elements provide resistance to connectivity and these others facilitate it. So that's pretty powerful. It's correlative, but it's pretty powerful, and it suggested that the connections between Kanha and Pench are really important. And should this become a barrier, first of all, it showed connectivity that animals are potentially moving between these protected areas, and that may seem obvious, but at the time it was evidence. So I think the big difference, and what I've tried to do, is that things may seem obvious, but unless we have hard evidence, we can't just say that, oh, yeah, that must be the case, right? That's the whole premise of science in a way. So then after that, we basically, followed up that study with a lot more detailed work, also including simulations, showing that, for example, first before the simulations, showing that it was human impacts, basically high density human settlements and high traffic roads, which provide resistance to movement. It doesn't matter if you have agriculture, actually. It's not that you have to have forest cover or green cover everywhere, natural habitat. Agriculture is also okay for dispersal of individuals. It is the high density human settlements like cities and the high traffic roads which basically provide barriers. So basically, we also then did simulations of future landscapes and suggested what kinds of scenarios would result in, improved connectivity, the same connectivity, worse connectivity, and hence impact extinction, because that's the ultimate, right? What you want to do is to conserve species. So that was work by Prachi Thatte, and it was really, I think, very interesting and important. But then that immediately pointed us to populations which may not be connected. And at that time, I met Dr. G.V. Reddy, who very sadly passed away recently, and he kept telling me, work in Rajasthan, work in Rajasthan. I was also curious because I knew that the tigers in Ranthambore were probably isolated. And so we started work there, trying to understand impacts of isolation. You know that there's no connectivity to Ranthambore. The tigers which were in Sariska were extinct, and those which were reintroduced were simply Ranthambore tigers. Plus, they are not connected at all. They're isolated populations. So yeah, that's when we started working on what's happening in isolated populations, and we showed, for example, that tigers in Ranthambore are twice as inbred as those anywhere else in the country, and they are isolated. So they all form one cluster, one genetic cluster, uh, because they're so similar to each other. Relatedness between individuals is between zero point 0.4, so siblings are zero point 0.5. But this relatedness is because they all have a common ancestor. So, they all are related to each other. And then around the same time, I was approached by another forest officer, Dr. Swan, who was very curious about the black tigers in Odisha. And he asked me, what do you think? Why do they look this way? Now, that seemingly is a very odd question and nothing to do with what we've worked on so far, but really it's connected in these, it's connected is probably not a good word in this context, but it's in the similar line of investigation. When you have isolated populations, you see strange or maybe different phenotypes which are coming up because of isolation. So the thing about the phenotype itself seemed challenging, but then I knew of other work where people had shown that these types of phenotypes in cats and cheetahs are caused by mutations in a specific gene. So that work was probably not known to the wildlife community in India, but it was literature which was kind of talked about quite a bit. So given that we had a candidate gene, so for example, if you're talking about something like diabetes, right? There are so many genes involved. It would be very difficult to find the genetic basis of it in a tiger population, just as an example, because there are so many genes involved. You can't get thousands and thousands of individuals and do a genotype as well as a phenotype, sequence their DNA, as well as look at, you know, how diabetic they are, for example. But this was 1-0. Either you're black or you're not, right? And that's what's called a Mendelian trait, which means it's a simple inheritance. And we basically figured it out. And then it was basically also about trying to understand why you have a high frequency of this allele or this mutation, single spelling mistake, it turned out to be in Similipal. And while we still don't know the answer to why, uh, we find that it is consistent with isolation. And we are just now learning about inbreeding in Similipal, something that I'm looking forward to in the next 2 years. So, yeah, so basically, this whole journey went from a broad understanding of landscapes, genetic landscapes in India, to focusing on what keeps the connected landscapes connected, to understanding what happens to these isolated populations. And that's kind of where we are now. But I hope in the future to understand more about the impacts of inbreeding, what will it look like, and what have we actually lost.
That was absolutely fascinating. For people who might not be familiar with the situation in Simlipal, it is quite interesting because the first quote unquote black tigers of Simlipal, these pseudomelanistic tigers, the first incident that we know of happened, I think, around 92 when this young Adivasi boy
Yes, yes,
shot a young
yes,
tigress in self-defense, and it turned out to be a black, as in
yes,
pseudomelanistic tiger. And nobody really, I mean, I'm sure Uma's research will eventually figure that out, but if I'm not mistaken, right now we don't know why that mutation suddenly appeared in 92 without any sort of historical record for the same.
yes.
Um, but that is very interesting. And now I think, Uma, your research has established that there are about, I don't know, 15 or more pseudomelanistic tigers, and if there is no if there is no new gene inflow into Simlipal, um, probably all the tigers might soon turn quote unquote black.
Yes.
If,
So,
if
yeah,
yeah,
sorry.
yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. No, so basically, this is a property of this phenomenon called genetic drift. That is, it's basically a random sampling, right? And so what happens is that when you have something which is at a high frequency, so you have two things. Like imagine you have a bag with red balls and green balls, and if the frequency or the occurrence of the red balls is zero point 0.7 and the green balls is zero point 0.3. When you pull out three balls, by chance, they'll all happen to be red, just because red is more common. So that's what's happening right now in Simlipal. It's a small population. And so by chance, the non-common mutation, which is in this case the wild type or the non-black mutation, is rarer than the black mutation. So when we did a survey based on genetics in 2018-19, where we collected fecal samples from Simlipal, identified tigers, and then looked at whether they had the black mutation or the normal mutation. Each tiger has two copies of them, right? One from the mother and one from the father. We found that the frequency of the black mutation was already at 0.58 or about 60%. Uh, Recent camera trap data suggests that half the tigers in Simlipal are quote unquote black. Now, since this is a recessive trait, which means I need two black mutations to look black, that suggests back calculating, back of the envelope, that the frequency of the black mutation in 2023, say, has gone up to 75%, because 0.75 squared is around zero point 0.5. So basically, already we see that it looks like the frequency has increased. In our paper in 2021, we had done simulations to say if there is no gene flow, even if the population increases in size, which it has increased, what will happen to this frequency of black? And those suggested that, within 50 years, it would be fixed, which means all individuals would be black. So yeah, so that is definitely what we are seeing. And it's, I don't know, it's like crazy when you have studied something in a textbook and you're actually seeing it playing out in wild populations of tigers. I mean, we internalize and accept evolution for bacteria. We accepted it in COVID. There were so many new strains coming up all the time. We accepted it. And that seems fine for bacteria and viruses, but to see tigers evolving, that seems like pretty crazy.
It indeed is. Speaking of the fact that Similipal is isolated, um, I'm at Palamu at the moment. It's very interesting that one of the tigers from here, as in not from here technically, but we'd like to call it from here. It walked from Sanjay Tiger Reserve in Madhya Pradesh, went through North Chhattisgarh, ended up here, I think around last December 2023. Stayed
Mhm.
here in Palamu for about 2, 3 months and then walked around and then eventually left the reserve, went through southern Jharkhand, and in April reached Simlipal. And now
Mhm.
we are hoping that it finally, it's a male. We hope that finally enters the tiger reserve. I'm told that it is still hanging around in the buffer area, just adjoining the territorial forest adjoining the tiger reserve. So, I mean, yeah, uh, as you
Yeah,
said,
that's
we are
really,
saying,
yeah.
yeah,
So I think it's amazing that I think actually that today, uh, I don't know, this is just a hunch. I think tigers are moving really long distances, maybe
understood.
compared to even the past, because in the past there was more contiguous habitat. And so it's really interesting to track these long distance movements. And that's really amazing. And of course, one would always hope for functional connectivity on the ground. That is, there's always routes of dispersal which animals can take. And we really don't know enough about animal behavior. As I said, the connectivity work we've done is correlative, right? If you were to do it as a more mechanistic exercise, you would model animal movement and ask what is the probability of animals moving and blah, blah, blah. But we don't know how and why animals choose to move the way they do, right? So to answer that, one would probably need to call a radio caller like 100 animals and see the choices they're making, like this habitat, that habitat. And even then, I'm not sure we could generalize. But yeah, so of course, it would be wonderful to have natural dispersal, but maybe waiting for that, it's a stochastic event, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it would be wonderful if it happens, and hopefully it'll continue to happen. The same thing has happened to Ranthambore, animal has moved all, well, nothing comes in, but an animal has moved all the way to Panna, uh, and then kind of, sorry, not Panna, to where are the cheetahs? Kuno, sorry, moved all the
Kuno.
way to Kuno, and then after many many years came all the way back.
Yeah,
So it's not
that is
like movement is
mm,
impossible, but it is just that how often does it happen, and is that enough?
yes, yes, absolutely. In fact,
Yeah.
this is maybe not exactly what I thought I'd ask you, but because we've brought up that discussion, I remember us having a very interesting discussion where you told me that there even might be genetic basis for why some individuals choose to travel a lot and others stick around to their natal area. And you told me about there is some study on fishes, how sort of genetic markers determine which fish will travel farther and which will stay
Yes.
around. And
Yes.
maybe we might someday find same thing about tigers that their
Yeah.
genetic makeup determines which are the long walkers and which decide to hang
Yes.
around their native habitat.
Yeah. I mean, yeah,
Uh,
that would be really cool. I really don't know. I think it might have something to do with personality. So there's a lot of work on personality, which suggests there are risk-taking individuals and those which are not so risk-taking. And these categories are scored in many, many species. So that has also risk taking is sometimes correlated with dominance in wolves, for example, but it's also correlated with migration or dispersal. So I think this would be a really fascinating question. I should maybe I should take some time to because it's kind of non-obvious, right? Like I feel like a lot
Yes,
of the things
yes,
I've
yes.
done are just okay, next, next, next.
No, no,
So it would be
no, that,
really path-breaking actually to try and figure out something like that. But yeah,
yes.
there's also some
Mm,
studies on birds which show that
mm,
there's genetic determinants of altitudinal migration, for example, and that has consequences, for example, for individuals which may survive impacts of climate change, right? So individuals which are able to migrate more altitudinally are more likely to survive following, say, warming in a mountain where the habitat is going to go up. So these are slowly studies coming out, and I think it would be really interesting to try and understand this better.
absolutely. Um, so I think you briefly touched upon it, but maybe if you could elaborate a bit more on how does the study of wildlife genetics impact conservation and conservation policy? Well, you could give us some examples too.
Yeah, so I think that so conservation policy is I guess I don't want to venture there first. I'll talk about conservation in terms of action. So basically, for example, the it takes a bit of time. I guess I can give you three examples from my work. So the first example is not with tigers; it's to do with montane birds. Work which I did together with a colleague, uh, Robin, VV Robin, who's now an associate professor at ISA Tirupati. But he was very curious about these shola birds. Sholas are montane habitats in the Western Ghats. And he felt that, for example, across the Palghat Gap, the birds didn't seem to recognize each other's song. So it was just an intuition initially from watching these birds in the field that made him wonder, are they really different? How different are they? And then when we investigated this for the entire community of montane birds, we found that overall, the shape of the mountain was driving patterns of differentiation. The two most different individuals of any bird would be on either side of the Palghat Gap because the gap was so deep, it was basically a barrier. And this is what's called a biogeographic barrier because it was a same extent barrier for all species, right? So it's not same extent, it was a barrier for all species. Now that led us to some kind of more taxonomic work where we showed that for what were called laughing thrushes and what were called shortwings, there were actually a new genera and 4 and 3 species respectively versus the one which was thought to be the case originally. So recently, actually, this was work published in 2015, 2017, and recently in the amendments to the Wildlife Protection Act, uh, some of these species have actually been included in Schedule 1. Now you'd ask why? Well, because now their range has completely shrunk, right? So earlier you thought that these birds occupied many of these habitat patches. So probably you thought they were okay in terms of their probabilities of extinction or conservation status. But now, basically, that's not the case. And some of them have very restricted ranges. And so they then become more endangered and hence worthy, quote unquote, of protection legally. So well, the way the Wildlife Protection Act is set up right now, it's a legal and a punitive act. It's not necessarily doing anything construct well positive for future conservation type of stuff. It's more legal and punitive. But regardless, and of course, this has downstream consequences on research. But regardless, the fact that this research within a few years led to the uplisting of these species is pretty amazing, right? And there was no lobbying for this. We didn't. There are no pathways for this. It's not like we said we're going to get this done, right? It happened, and that to me is really amazing that the research permeated in the community, and it actually happened. Similarly, with the work on connectivity in the Central Indian landscape, Aditya Joshi's thesis resulted in a stay on the expansion of NH7, and then the subsequent paper, and also Prachi Thatte's work, as well as work of others, folks from WII and also others together were presented as evidence in court against the expansion of NH7 through a public interest litigation, right? which is a citizen tool to kind of counter anything which seems inappropriate. And basically, the court suggested that, by expanding NH7, this will result in loss of connectivity and loss of a biological process, and so ordered, the National Highway Authority of India to build a underpass for wildlife, right? So that was concrete on the ground type stuff, right? And then finally, most recently, this isolation of populations and our work on both Similipal and Ranthambore has resulted in an order from NTCA allowing for the movement of individuals for genetic replenishment. So earlier there was no cognizance of these terminologies itself. So that itself it's not policy, but it is some kind of potential action on the ground.
Fascinating is all I can say, because it is very, very interesting, and you know, how to see how pertinent genetics has become and understanding of genetics has become in today's conservation scenario.
Yeah,
Earlier, it used to be one of those sciencey things that is out there and
correct.
doesn't really have a bearing on conservation, but now it
Exactly.
does. Uh, and now I think you've, moving from tigers to another charismatic species, elephants.
Mm-hmm.
You've just published a very important, with your co-author, you've just published a very important paper on the genetic study of India's elephant population. Could you please tell us a bit more about that and what have been the most significant finds from this exercise and what you think the conservation implications would be?
Yeah. So Raza, thanks for bringing that up. Something we've been working on for some time. I actually started my journey in wildlife working on elephants with Sukumar 25 years ago. And I have a picture to, to prove it. It's collecting dung actually of elephants. So it's been really an honor and really a privilege for me to delve into this. But what we found is basically that there are, five kind of populations or genetic landscapes of elephants in the Indian subcontinent. The northeast population and Tarai, which is basically one unit, and then uh, you know what we call the central unit, which is basically southern West Bengal, etc. We have not sampled elephants from Odisha, but we think that they probably are also part of this unit. And then in southern India, we actually have three populations or units: north of the Palghat Gap, south of the Palghat Gap, and quite surprisingly, south of the Shenkota Gap. What's really interesting also is these divergences between these populations as understood by, say, basically using the genomes and doing models, simulation models which we match to the observed data are pretty deep, between 70 to 100,000 years old. So basically between the northern and central and southern clusters. Within southern clusters as well, the divergences are on the order of 20,000 years, which is really old. Like the Palghat Gap is 40 kilometers wide, nothing for an elephant, right? So I think what was surprising for us was A, that there is strong population structure for such a mobile species, which has, moves really, really long distances. So this suggests that maybe we should look into conservation at these spatial scales. How do we actually think about conservation of, for example, the population south of the Shenkota Gap, right? Where there may be 150 or so elephants. Okay. We also see a dilution of genetic diversity. So basically, as you go from north to south, you have the most genetic diversity here, and then subsets or less genetic diversity. Not always subsets, but generally less genetic diversity as you go from north to south. And so basically, by extension, then the population south of the Shenkota Gap has low variation and also high inbreeding. So, what does this mean in terms of how do we manage elephants? How do we move elephants? Definitely, we need to understand more about the central population, and we also need to understand more about the south of Shenkota Gap population. What are like so that's has to be more fine scale. Now, what conservation action is required for each population will require kind of more fine scale studies to understand that. So yeah, so it's basically opening the door in some sense to our understanding of elephants in India. They have colonized from the north to the south, and there's an associated dilution of diversity. And there are, multiple populations, potentially management units in the country. And so we should probably, their history in that sense helps us think about their conservation for the future.
That is fascinating. So, Uma, as somebody, as a lay person, I wanted to understand, does this mean that elephants as in say, the elephants don't migrate across the uh, Palagat Gap or the Shenkota Gap? As in, there is no absolutely zero intermingling of those uh, populations across the gap?
So basically, if it has been there, it has been at a low level, so that the samples that at least we have show deeper divergence, right? So there are instances of animals moving, walking across. I mean, we know of that, right? But maybe, like you're saying about the tiger which moved such a long distance, maybe it's so rare that it hasn't had a significant impact on the entire gene pool, right? But like I said, I think more detailed studies where we look at these, because all of these are landscapes. When I say south of Shenkota Gap, it's a large area, right? And we need to actually understand more fine scale landscape genetics and connectivity in those kind of areas. So this study is probably akin to a study really long ago, for tigers. Like our knowledge is like 10 years maybe behind. I should mention that TNC Vidya several years ago did a study on elephants with a limited marker set, mitochondrial DNA, which is maternally inherited, and some nuclear markers, and did suggest deep divergence. So it was, while those they're not as comparable in terms of how the analysis was done, there was some hints of this, and so I think it was important to kind of do this study.
And I'm very intrigued by the fact that you also think that the central Indian population of elephants looks to be needs to be looked into further,
Yes.
because I'm in Palamu at the moment, and if you go into the history of elephants in this landscape, there were no elephants in Palamu right up till the 1940s, and the elephants seem to have appeared sometime maybe around the 50s or late 40s, because the British absolutely they had very strong presence in Palamu, and they kept they documented the fauna of this landscape pretty well, and they've documented a lot of species that have gone extinct. Elephant is a very interesting animal that is completely absent from this landscape. And now we have about 100 and maybe 100, more than 100 elephants at least in the tiger reserve.
Hmm.
And I have always heard this theory coming from people here that these elephants, somebody would say that these are captive released elephants which went feral eventually. The others say that they came from Odisha. Somebody says that came from Sarguja Maharaja's stables. I've tried asking those families and they have no idea. So it's a mystery where these elephants appeared from. Maybe hopefully someday if we can do the genetic sampling from these landscapes, it would help solve the mystery of where did Palamu's elephants suddenly appear from after I don't know, after having no trace of them during the colonial period. So yeah, so
Yeah,
I
yeah,
yeah.
I think you're right. I think in the central landscape, there's been a lot of colonizations. For example, elephants have recently colonized Bandhavgarh. They've colonized all the way close to Tadoba. So basic at Kachiroli. So basically, I think in some sense that Central Indian landscape is a microcosm of this colonization processes, and it would be very interesting because when you have colonization, again you have the serial founding. That is, some individuals go and found that population, right? So in elephants, it might be a group or something like that. So that again becomes like a bottleneck, right? So it would be very interesting to look at this in more detail with historical or whatever recent history information and test hypotheses about the impacts of that and what's happening to these newly founded populations.
Uma, no, that's a very interesting answer on the colonization of elephant Central India. I would maybe call it recolonization. In fact, I've just
Yes, yes, yes.
submitted a paper
Expansion.
on
Yeah.
yes. I've just submitted a paper on the history of elephants in Central India for review. Hopefully, it might be out soon. And it is
That would
very
be great.
interesting. One of the key findings, was, among other things, is that there were extensive elephant populations throughout Central India right up till the late 16th century. Would you believe it that we had elephants in Puno?
Yes.
Akbar. So they were going up, and in Gujarat as well. And but what was quite fascinating was that even during the colonial era, we had large elephant populations in Chhattisgarh. And now that the elephants that are recolonizing, or the way they have recolonized the pathways that they have taken, it is very intriguing that all these pathways are pretty much along the same forest and the same migration routes to which they used to migrate when they were found resident in these areas, and the way they eventually went extinct. So even the Britishers record that in the early mid 19th century, elephants would move from, say, the Sarguja and Hasdeo, what is now Hasdeo forest, and into Kanha and towards Bandhavgarh. And this is exactly the same path that these elephants had recolonized almost 150 years after they went extinct from that area have taken. So I wonder if it is just just the fact that this is the most preferred pathway due to the habitat factors, or there is some genetic imprinting. Who knows?
Yeah, yeah. So that's
Mm.
really interesting. And I was just actually in this conversation, I've been thinking that maybe, this is a research direction I should really spend some time thinking about is, these pathways of movement. Like in Africa, you have this idea of this great migration, and but I'm not sure how much of science, it's more like documentary, natural history stuff,
Yes,
but
yes,
how much of scientific deconstruction of this has
we can do.
happened, and be really interesting to use hypotheses based on historical literature, or even maybe indigenous people accounts, and so on, and then maybe actually test these somehow, uh, based on what you would predict from a connectivity framework, and what you see is behavior in some way, behavior whether genetic or something else, behavioral choices driving this more than, we're thinking of it as like physical, where is forest, where is not, doesn't matter what the species is, you're not really invoking anything about the species. And that's really interesting. Even from,
No,
say, for example, we did some work recently on connectivity for gore and sambar, and their patterns are different compared to, say, tigers. So one size does not fit all, and there may be different patterns of movement, and the distributions would have been different. So yeah, it's really interesting to think about.
yes, and I think, I mean, it's a hunch, but again, talking of hunches, you mentioned that V.V. Robin first had that hunch about the birds being
Yes.
different, and I was very recently reading this fascinating article by Dr. Nayanjot Lahiri, the history professor at Ashoka and also archaeologist, and he was explaining how it was a hunch that led to the discovery of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, as in almost 20 years before the actual excavations took place.
Mhm.
Marshall had a hunch that there is something very interesting here, and we must follow it up, and it took them 20 years. But they so she was in fact, that the whole article was about that, even though it is maybe not scientifically uh, something that we can prove, but hunches sometimes do play a key role in driving research direction.
Definitely. I mean, I think that if you think about it, like natural history itself often provides a hypothesis for more, kind of deconstructive science. And so I think with no a priori knowledge at all, going into questions is a little is different. And I think basically science is about the unknown, right? It's about exploring the unknown. So uh, you can go into the unknown with a little, you're a bit more confident if you have a little bit of a hunch
Yeah,
which direction to sort of go in. Yeah.
go ahead. So, full disclosure, I'm working with you on an interesting project looking into the genetic history of tigers in India,
Yeah.
especially from landscapes in East Central India, where they have largely disappeared over the past few decades. So, I would like you to tell our audience a bit more about this project, what we are doing, and what we hope to achieve through this study.
So Raza, thanks for asking that question. That's something I'm really excited about as well over the next few years to learn about the past of India's tigers. So basically, I've always been fascinated by the past. During my postdoc, I worked with Elizabeth Hadley on ancient DNA, trying to understand the response of small mammals in the Yellowstone ecosystem to impacts of climate. For example, there was a short warming period called the medieval warm period where the temperature increased by a degree. So we were looking at, before that and after that, how did species respond? So in the context of endangered species, the largest impacts on their distributions and basically their things which affect their extinction probability and their future has been in the last 200 years. So we don't need to go back thousands of years, but we do need to understand and be able to acquire genetic material from archival samples, like historic samples. And this also coincides with trophy hunting. We know that a large number of tigers uh, were hunted in the last 200 plus years in the British Raj times and then later following independence prior to the Wildlife Protection Act. So our goal, together with you, our goal is to understand this past and especially understand the past in contexts where tigers are currently extinct. For example, in areas like Chhattisgarh, parts of Jharkhand, and also parts of Odisha, for example, and maybe parts of West Bengal. So basically, what we are doing is to collect archival material. The what was needed was to actually set up a facility which allows us to work with such material. So my lab space at NCBS, we work with a lot of tiger blood, with tiger feces and hair, and these all have a lot of tiger DNA. But this archival material, this trophy material, will have very less tiger DNA comparatively. So if we mix the spaces, if we start working with these skins in that space, there's a high chance of contamination. And we need to be really very cautious about the science to make sure that it's valid. So what we've done is we've set up a separate space where we are working with archival material only. And I'm looking forward to you coming and seeing that space in your next visit. But basically, we did that, and very excitingly, our initial collection trip was in Chhattisgarh. We were there in February. And since then, we have also collected material from BNHS and other places in the initial set of samples. And we did Madhya Pradesh as well. We did have a pretty good success in uh, getting DNA from these samples. The goal is then to basically fill out. If you look at tiger distribution today, they're like mostly constricted into these pockets of protected areas. Because there are tigers outside protected areas, but still most tigers are in these small islands of habitat that remain for them, we have set aside for them. And so hopefully by sampling in areas like Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, etc., we can fill in this picture of tiger genetic variation. They were almost continuously distributed. And what have we lost? Have we simply lost tigers? Have we lost specific genetic variants, which doesn't matter so much? Or is there something very specific that we have lost? So basically, we'll be comparing the past to the present, looking at how changes in population size have broadly affected tiger diversity. Is there a geography effect? Did we lose something special when we lost the tigers of Chhattisgarh? And so on. So a lot of questions, but like with all science, the first step is making sure that you have reliable data. So we've been, I think, I hope you would agree, we've been reaching out to people. We've been trying to have a very broad approach, inclusive approach to getting people to participate in this study. And I think that's really fun, like to be able to talk to all kinds of people and try and convince them to bring their trophies into this study. And I think we've been pretty successful. A lot of people have shown interest, and there's more and more momentum building. I'm pretty sure we should be able to sample, between 150 to 200 trophies. I mean, I don't know, maybe not, but I'm thinking on that scale across mainly Rajasthan to Odisha, Jharkhand, like to the west, to the east. Of course, we will also have some samples from the south and from the northeast and the Terai and so on. So yeah, so that's where we are, and the next steps are to keep building up these data sets. We also, as you know, have a grant to collaborate with people in the UK, where there are probably slightly older materials. They're mostly in museums, but that would be very nice because they would be potentially during the British Raj times. 1912, for example, there's a large set of samples from the 1912, 1914 collection trip, which the British did, and many of them are deposited in the Natural History Museum, London. So basically, we will be trying to piece together through time the story of tigers through by looking at their genetic variation linked to geography. So how has this changed over time?
You know very well how excited I am about this project, and I actually think that we can get probably around 150 samples in all. Um, we've already got 8 from Jharkhand, and we might get few more, and then there's Odisha to look forward to as well. But yeah, you're right. I've been always been curious about as you said, what kind of genetic markers we lost because. Uh, One of the interesting variations among tigers that was found in this area, as in I'm talking of Jharkhand, was we tend to associate white tigers with Riva and Mohan. Interestingly, whose sample or whose progeny sample we have, you can correct me on that. But in fact, if you go into the history, it was this landscape of northern Jharkhand, that is Hazaribagh, which was
Yes.
the one could call the headquarters of white tigers in a way, because I think about more than 20 or almost 30 tigers were shot in as many years. White tigers were shot in as many years in this landscape, and then there were a few that were shot in northern Chhattisgarh, some in central Odisha, and we suddenly see that, and there are quite a few others that are recorded in this area, but Hazaribagh was quite unique because it had many white tigers that were shot, and this is that we know of that were shot. So I'm pretty sure there were many more that were not shot or were not recorded. Um, and then we see suddenly this whatever genetic variation or whatever gene was causing this anomaly, if you would like to call it, and then it suddenly disappears from the wild. And Mohan is the last known white tiger that we know of. So it will be really interesting to look into what if genetics can tell us what it is, what caused this. You've traced one of the, I mean, it would be interesting for others who that the skin is kept in the palace in Patiala of all the places in Punjab. So God knows how it went there, but so we'll hopefully get to sample that as well and see what it yields. Um, and now I think this is a good sort of, segue to, because we're talking of the past, now maybe it is time to talk of the future. So, uh, how do you envision the future of wildlife in India? What are some of the major challenges that you see as we look into the future, and what prescriptions would you offer for tackling these challenges?
So of course, I should give a disclaimer that I'm not an on-ground conservationist. I'm a scientist. But I think that the future will require a lot of dialogue between NGOs, between scientists, and between managers, uh, and maybe in some sense, private entities for funding and things like that as well. It has to be a collaborative endeavor, and I think it has to be really about dialogue, back and forth, not just that did this work, moved on, and not about silos. So I guess I would say this is my hope for the future. In terms of what is required, I think that a nimble action and uh, adaptive management is going to be required. We cannot be stuck in, okay, this is the way we do things, because the challenges are facing, animals are different. Like we were talking about elephants, there's all kinds of new behavioral strategies of, male groups and crop breeding and stuff like that. There may be a lot of animals are also changing, and they're also resilient. They are all colonizing new areas. So how are we going to respond to that with protection, facilitation, and also management? So overall, I think that so far we've been doing more monitoring, who is where, how many, etc. But I think that the future is going to be more about management. How do we ensure these survive here? How do we ensure that there's movement or connectivity is maintained? So, more of active intervention, and facilitated hopefully by evidence, and in a just way, so that it's not, really insensitive and violating of human rights. So I think that that would be, I hope, the way forward. And I'm really excited, and I think it's a challenge for a lot of early career researchers, because on the other hand, if you see the academic field of science, it has become quite professionalized, and you're expected to, deliver certain things by certain times in your career and so on. And sometimes we tend to then do less risky things, which may not be, of course, at the interface with society. Anything which is at the interface with society has inherent challenges, right? So I think, uh, I hope that early career researchers and researchers of the future will take this challenge of interaction and engagement and dialogue, and keep it as one of the most important things in their work, not just about doing excellent science or finding something very novel, but how do we translate that, work with others to internalize that and implement, uh, you know, uh, what that means on the ground. And that sounds probably philosophical and preachy, but I think that I hope that we'll see a future of more collaboration, interaction, and the breaking of silos.
Not at all preachy and philosophical. I think that was the perfect answer I could have thought of. But no, I completely agree with, especially on the collaboration bit, and that ensuring that whatever you're doing, even if it's on the ground conservation or science, or if you're contributing in any other way, it's important to collaborate and ensure that you're talking to others and not working in silos. I think that's a perfect perfect thought to end this conversation with. It was a pleasure having you, Uma. I think I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. I'm sure it will be the case with anybody who watches this as well. Thank you so much for
Thanks so
being
much,
here,
Raza.
and
Thanks for having me.
and I hope to see you again soon.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.